We will apply maximum pressure to maximize our leverage. That's why today we're moving forward with a 25% surcharge on electricity exports.
Look, we've been treated very unfairly by Canada. We've been treated very unfairly by Mexico. But we've been treated very unfairly by every country all over the world.
Ontario just threatened to cut electricity to 1.5 million American homes. March 2025, Premier Doug Ford imposed a 25% export tax on Canadian electricity flowing to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. Trump retaliated by threatening to double tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel to 50%. A century-old integrated electricity grid between Canada and the US, now on the brink of collapse. This isn't just about tariffs. This is Canada's clean hydroelectric power being weaponized in a trade war that could destroy energy security on both sides of the border. I'm going to break down exactly what collapsed, why Canadian premiers are threatening to flip the power switch, how this affects electricity bills on both sides of the border, and what happens when a 100-year energy partnership implodes. Because while politicians trade threats, millions of people could lose power. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want to understand how Trump's tariffs just broke the North American energy grid. March 4th, 2025. Trump imposed 10% tariffs on Canadian electricity imports as part of his broader 25% tariff package. March 10th, 2025. Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exported to 3 U.S. states. Ford threatened to shut down exports entirely. I will do it with a smile on my face. Let me spell out what just broke. For more than a century, the US and Canada have sold each other electricity through power lines that crisscross the border. More than 30 major transmission lines connect nearby US and Canadian cities and regions. The two countries operate by the same reliability standards, despite the political boundary between them. A 2003 blackout cut power to 50 million people on both sides of the border because the systems are so integrated. And now Trump wants to tariff that integration while Ford threatens to shut it down completely. 2024, Canada exported 27 million megawatt hours of electricity to the United States. Canada exports enough electricity to power more than 5.6 million US homes. In 2023, the US bought $3.2 billion worth of electricity from Canada. That's clean hydroelectric power, Quebec's massive dams, Ontario's nuclear and hydro mix, British Columbia's hydroelectric capacity, all flowing south to help US states meet climate goals while keeping the lights on. States like New York and Massachusetts have tried to reduce carbon emissions in part by buying Canadian electricity, which is most commonly generated through hydroelectric power. Trade disputes between the two countries could complicate those climate goals. Here's what Ford threatened specifically. Ontario's 25% electricity export tax would affect 1.5 million homes in Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. Ford told NBC, "We keep the lights on for 1.5 million homes and manufacturing in New York, in Michigan, and in Minnesota. If he wants to destroy our economy and our families, I will shut down the electricity going down to the US, and I'm telling you, we will do it." Ford previously described flipping the power switch as an option of last resort, but now says he would do so with a smile on my face. "I want to inflict as much pain as we possibly can," Ford told reporters on March 4th. This marks the first major threat to the two countries' shared electricity grid in a century, and the consequences don't just affect Ontario or border states, they ripple across both countries. Now let me show you what this means for electricity bills. Ontario Premier Doug Ford estimates that his 25% electricity tariff could cost homes and businesses $277,000 daily, increasing US monthly bills by $69 or more. $69 more per month on your electricity bill if you live in New York, Michigan, or Minnesota. Not because electricity costs more to produce, because politicians are using your power supply as a bargaining chip in a tariff war. New York State is likely to feel the brunt of Ontario's electricity tariff since they receive up to 2,500 megawatts from Ontario and 2,100 megawatts from Quebec. 4,600 megawatts of Canadian power keeping New York's lights on, all now subject to tariffs or potential shutdown. Households in border states that rely heavily on Canadian electricity, particularly rural or colder states such as Maine and Vermont, would bear the brunt of tariff-induced price increases. Rural Maine, Vermont in winter, northern Michigan, these aren't wealthy urban centers that can absorb $69 monthly increases. These are communities where Canadian hydroelectric power has been essential for decades because it's clean, reliable, and affordable. Here's the scale of what's at risk. U.S. states and regions near the border, New York, New England, the Midwest, and the West Coast, typically buy the most Canadian electricity. While electricity shared across the border represents less than 1% of the total power generated by both countries, the trade is critical to ensuring that electric supply meets consumer demand. That 1% sounds small until you realize it's the margin that prevents blackouts. When demand spikes during heat waves or cold snaps, Canadian imports fill the gap. When Canadian hydroelectric production drops due to drought, U.S. exports flow north. The system works because it's integrated. Power transmission lines linking the United States and Canada are part of a complex and highly interconnected power system, with connections spanning from New England to the Pacific Northwest. Trump's response to Ontario's threat. March 11, 2025. Trump threatened raising tariffs on aluminum and steel to 50%, further intensifying the trade war. Why would our country allow another country to supply us with electricity even for a small area? Trump questioned. Because that small area is 5.6 million American homes. Because Canadian hydroelectric power is clean and helps U.S. states meet climate targets. Because the integrated grid has prevented blackouts for a century. Because both countries benefit from sharing surplus electricity when the other needs it. But Trump doesn't care about grid reliability. He sees Canadian electricity as leverage, and Canadian premiers are responding in kind. Quebec also produces more hydroelectric power than it uses. It has long-term export contracts to supply electricity to New York State, home to almost 20 million people. It's also a major source of revenue for the provincial government. Quebec's contracts with New York, decades-long agreements that have powered America's largest city with clean Canadian hydro. All now threatened because Trump wanted to impose border security tariffs that have nothing to do with electricity trade. Here's what makes this particularly insane. 2024, Canada exported enough electricity to power approximately 3.4 million U.S. homes. Exports declined from 65 TW1 in 2022 to 49 TW1 in 2023 and 30 TW1 in 2024, while their value fell from $5.8 billion to $2.6 billion. Exports already dropping because of drought conditions reducing Canadian hydroelectric production. And now, Trump wants to tariff what remains while Canadian provinces threaten to cut it off entirely. Following the imposition of U.S. tariffs, Ontario, Manitoba, Quebec, and British Columbia considered reducing their electricity exports to the U.S. 4 provinces, representing the vast majority of Canadian electricity exports, all considering retaliation. Not just Ontario's forward-making threats, Manitoba, Quebec, and BC also weighing options to restrict exports or impose counter tariffs. Now let me explain what this means for Canada. Even though Canada is a net exporter, Canada still imports from the US, and those imports are significant in the areas where they are used. BC is going through a drought cycle and has been importing more electricity over the last few years. British Columbia importing US electricity during droughts. If US electricity costs rise due to tariffs, that increases BC's import costs. If electricity costs go up in the US, that raises the price for US exports to Canada too. So Canadian consumers get hit twice. First, when provinces impose export restrictions that reduce revenue from selling surplus power. Second, when they need to import US electricity at higher tariff-inflated prices. A decline in exports could mean reduced revenues at home. The electricity sold is often surplus electricity, which is not needed in that moment. If there is extra flow or wind, it makes sense to sell to neighbors and everyone benefits. Surplus hydroelectric power. When Quebec's reservoirs are full, when Ontario's nuclear plants generate excess capacity, when BC's rivers are running high, that surplus gets exported to the US for revenue that helps keep Canadian electricity rates lower. Cut off exports, and Canadian utilities lose that revenue stream while still maintaining expensive infrastructure. Here's the economic devastation. If a 25% tariff were implemented on all electricity imports to the United States from Canada, the total cost would have ranged from $629 million in 2019 to as much as $1.5 billion in 2022. A 10% tariff would have ranged from $250 million in 2019 to $580 million in 2022, between $250 million and $1.5 billion in annual tariff costs. Money that doesn't improve electricity generation, doesn't upgrade infrastructure, doesn't benefit consumers. Pure deadweight loss from trade war stupidity. On a per-unit basis, the impact of a 25% tariff would have ranged from around $9 million in 2020 to as much as $22 million in both 2022 and 2024, $9 to $22 per megawatt hour in tariff costs, passed directly to American consumers. Your electricity bill going up not because power got more expensive to generate, but because Trump wanted leverage over Canada on border security. Applying the 25% and 10% tariff to exports from Canada would result in an increase in commodity costs of around 0.14% to 0.35% for U.S. electricity consumers. That sounds small until you remember that's national average. For border states importing significant Canadian power, the impact is much higher. Maine, Vermont, New York, Michigan, Minnesota, all facing substantially larger increases. Here's what Canadian provinces are doing in response. Ontario barred U.S. firms from bidding on contracts with Ontario Power Generation and the Independent Electricity System Operator. American companies that have worked with Ontario's electricity system for decades banned from new contracts. Retaliation spreading beyond electricity exports to procurement, equipment supply, consulting services, the entire integrated electricity relationship fracturing. Now let me show you the long-term damage. A professor of U.S.-Canada relations. That's what makes this sort of tariff war really self-defeating for both countries, is the fact that we've benefited from access to cheap energy. Some Canadians have argued in the past that the country should export less of its energy to the US and instead share it within its own borders. Those views had typically been dismissed, but more Canadians are coming around to the idea given Trump's recent attacks on the country, Canadian nationalism rising, keep our clean power for ourselves becoming mainstream political opinion. Quebec's hydroelectric capacity, why export it to New York when Ontario and Atlantic Canada need it? BC's renewable energy, why send it to California when Alberta's grid could use it? Once that political shift happens, it doesn't reverse easily. Even if tariffs get lifted, even if Ford and Trump eventually back down, the trust is broken. Future Canadian governments will hesitate to build electricity export infrastructure when they've seen how quickly it can become a political weapon. Here's the climate disaster buried in this trade war. U.S. electricity operators likely have enough short-term capacity to replace any Canadian power that is withheld or becomes too expensive to buy, but it may come from a different source. Translation: natural gas, coal, fossil fuels. Canadian hydroelectric power is clean, zero emissions. If U.S. states replace Canadian imports with natural gas plants, they're replacing clean energy with fossil fuels. Climate targets? Destroyed. States like New York and Massachusetts trying to reduce carbon emissions by buying Canadian electricity, those climate goals get complicated by trade disputes. New York pledged to reduce emissions. Massachusetts committed to clean energy targets. Both relied on Canadian hydroelectric imports to hit those targets without building expensive renewable capacity domestically. Trump's tariffs just forced them to choose between climate goals and energy security. Here's the bottom line for people on both sides of the border. A century-old electricity partnership that kept 5.6 million American homes powered with clean Canadian energy, threatened by tariffs that have nothing to do with electricity. Ontario threatening to cut power to 1.5 million U.S. homes. Trump threatening to double tariffs in response. Neither side backing down. American electricity bills rising 69 PLAs per month in border states. Canadian provinces losing billions in export revenue. Clean hydroelectric power being replaced by fossil fuel generation. Grid reliability threatened. Climate targets abandoned. All because Trump wanted leverage on border security and Canadian premiers decided electricity exports were their best retaliation tool. This story will define North American energy security for the next decade. Stay tuned.